The night had only just settled over Baker Street when the question arrived in paper and silver. It came first as a sound, boots on the step below, impatient and uncertain, as though the wearer had climbed too quickly and now regretted the effort. Then the knock, not the bold rap of a man who believes himself welcome, but the careful tapping of someone who fears the door might open on ridicule. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps followed, brisk and offended on our behalf, and I heard her murmur before she called it up the stairs, "A gentleman, sir, from the solicitors. He looks as though London has kept him out all night." Holmes did not rise at once. He never did. He remained in the armchair by the fire, long fingers steepled beneath his chin, gaze unfixed as if he were listening to a sound beyond the room. Only when the sitting-room door opened did he move, and then it was not to stand but to glance. A single, quick measurement of the visitor, of the damp on his coat, the shine of his hat, the particular kind of grime that settles into cuffs when a man has been leaning on office counters, pleading, waiting. The clerk stepped in as if he expected the carpet to accuse him. He was young, though his face had acquired the drawn look of someone paid to believe in other people's problems until his own life became a series of borrowed calamities. His collar was frayed. His ink-stained fingers held a parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine, the knot so tight it had bitten into itself. Under one arm he carried a folded document, thick with seals. "I beg your pardon," he began, and though his voice tried for professionalism, it had the thin edge of sleeplessness. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes." Holmes inclined his head without warmth or hostility, as if the man had asked whether the sky was still above us. "My name is Edwin Phipps," the clerk continued. "I am employed by Finch and Roper, solicitors of Chancery Lane. I was instructed to place this," he lifted the parcel as though it might explode, "into your hands, and to request that you read a deposition aloud, exactly as written, without interruption." "Watson," he glanced toward me, as if measuring whether I might be made an ally. "Forgive me, doctor, but I was told to ensure there are witnesses to the reading. The woman who gave it refuses to speak it again." Holmes's eyes went, not to the paper, but to the parcel. "Sit down, Mr. Phipps," he said. "You have been standing in damp air too long to keep upright without resentment. Mrs. Hudson, tea, if you please." The clerk sat on the edge of the chair, parcel on his knees, deposition clutched like a shield. His gaze kept flicking to Holmes's hands, as if he feared what those hands might do to a knot, to a seal, to the careful order of things. "You were told to ensure witnesses," Holmes repeated, almost lazily. "By whom?" "Mr. Oliver Finch himself," Phipps said, "and by the housekeeper, Mrs. Harrow." Holmes's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. Housekeepers are the true archivists of England. They keep more history in their drawers than Parliament keeps in its chambers. "Give me the parcel." Phipps hesitated. I saw his fingers tighten around the twine. It was not reluctance to surrender property. It was a man's fear that an object, once passed into other hands, would stop obeying the story attached to it. Holmes held out his palm. Nothing else, no impatience, no coaxing. Phipps gave it up. The parcel made no sound as Holmes laid it on the table beside the fire. The paper was damp at the edges, darkened where fog had kissed it. The twine was old, the fibers rough. Holmes did not cut it immediately. He rested his fingertips on the knot, and for a moment he seemed to forget we were there at all. Then he looked at Phipps. "Before we open it," Holmes said softly, "tell me why your right hand is trembling and your left is not." Phipps blinked. "Aye, sir." "You have been gripping that parcel hard enough to keep it from being taken," Holmes went on. "Your right hand did the work. Your left hand held the deposition. Paper is not heavy. Your right hand is tired. Your left is steady. Now, why are you afraid?" The clerk swallowed. His Adam's apple bobbed as though it wished to escape. "Because," he said, and the word came out scraped, "because the house says the watch stopped at the moment a man vanished, and because the house also says the room was locked." Holmes's gaze slid to me, and I recognized that look. the quiet ignition, the moment a dull evening became a case. A locked room is a dramatic thing to offer, Holmes said. It suggests either a miracle or a lie. Which does Mrs. Harrow prefer? She doesn't prefer anything, Phipps said. She refuses. She gave the statement only once in the presence of Mr. Finch, and she made him swear it would be read to you exactly. She said if anyone altered a word, she would go straight to the magistrate herself. Mrs. Hudson returned with tea, and the momentary comfort of china and steam seemed almost rude in the face of the clerk's pallor. Holmes waited until the door closed again. Then he undid the twine with a single motion that made Phipps flinch. Inside the paper lay a silver watch. It was handsome in that sober way Victorian objects can be. No frivolous jewels, no gaudy engraving, only clean workmanship, the faint shine of years polished by careful fingers. The chain was looped neatly, and as Holmes lifted it, the links glimmered in the firelight like a line of small moons. Holmes did not bring it to his ear. He did not attempt to wind it. He simply held the chain between finger and thumb, paused, and let the smallest change pass across his face. "What is it?" I asked. Holmes lowered the chain and for a brief second pressed it against the back of his hand, as though testing the honesty of metal. "Warm," he said. Phipps stared. "Sir." "The chain is warm," Holmes repeated. "Not warm from this room, warm from a body, from being worn inside a coat near a waistcoat pocket. Yet the parcel is cold with fog and street air. That suggests the watch has not been lying sealed in brown paper as long as you think it has." Phipps's lips parted. He seemed ready to argue, then thought better of it. "It was given to me in that wrapping," he said quickly. "In my office. I left at once." "And yet," Holmes murmured, turning the watch so the case caught the light, "it retains heat, as if it has been held within the last half-hour." Phipps's eyes flicked to the watch and away again, as though it offended him to be examined by anything more honest than fear. Holmes set the watch down and finally unfolded the deposition. The paper crackled, heavy with legal ceremony. A seal sat like a dull red wound at the bottom. "I assume," Holmes said, "that I am to read aloud." "Yes," Phipps whispered, "exactly." Holmes began, and his voice changed. Not louder, not more dramatic, but precise, as if he were laying rails for a train that would carry us somewhere whether we wished it or not. "I, Eliza Harrow, housekeeper of the residence known as Ashdown House, being of sound mind and aware that falsehood in sworn statement is punishable under law." The deposition spoke in the sober cadence of a woman who had spent her life smoothing other people's crises until her own composure became a form of armor. Mrs. Harrow described a household of careful routines. Breakfast at 8, the drawing room aired, the silver polished on Tuesdays, the widow's sitting room kept warm even when the rest of the house shivered under coal rationing and pride. She described a recent settlement, an inheritance matter concluded at last, after months of quiet tension that made the servants whisper and the family smile too widely at dinner. Then she described the day the house turned peculiar. "It began," she said, "with tea in the late afternoon in the sitting room of the late master's widow. There were 4 present, the widow herself, her late husband's stepbrother, the family solicitor, and Mr. Reginald Ashdown, the man who would later be called missing. Mrs. Harrow was not in the room, but she was near enough to hear, and she had been in houses long enough to know when voices are raised not from anger but from desperation. She wrote that she heard Mr. Ashdown speak the words, 'You will ruin us,' and that the widow replied in a tone so controlled it frightened her, 'You have already begun.' A tea tray was carried in. The maid, trembling, set it down and fled. Mrs. Harrow confessed that she followed, not out of nosiness, but because she feared for the household's peace. Then came a sharper sound. Something struck the mantelpiece, perhaps, or a hand slapped wood in emphasis. A watch ticked, a chair scraped. The sitting room door, Mrs. Harrow wrote, was then closed from within. She insisted on that point with such determination that I could almost see her face as she wrote it. The stubborn righteousness of someone who knows exactly where the line between accident and crime is drawn, and who is determined not to let any gentleman shift it for convenience. Minutes passed, the voices lowered, then there was silence. The solicitor knocked, no answer. The stepbrother tried the handle, locked. Mrs. Harrow wrote that she fetched the spare key from its place, an old, proper key kept on a hook in the pantry, used only when the widow mislaid hers. She swore in ink and seal that she fetched it herself, that no one else touched it, that the hook was empty when she returned and still empty when she replaced it. So they opened the door. The room was empty. Not merely absent of Mr. Ashdown, empty in the way a room is empty when something has been removed with intention. The fire still glowed. The tea sat untouched, one cup half filled as though lifted and set down without a sip. The window was latched, the bell-pull hung still, and on the rug near the hearth lay the silver watch, chain uncoiled like a dropped thought. Mrs. Harrow wrote that it had stopped at precisely 17 minutes past 5. She also wrote, and here the deposition's calm took on a dreadful sharpness, that she believed the disappearance was staged to force a confession, that the house was being made into a theatre, that someone wanted someone else to admit a thing they could not bear spoken aloud. Holmes read that line without emphasis, yet the room seemed to cool with it. I watched Phipps as a man watches a candle in a draught. His eyes were fixed, unblinking, as if he feared that to blink would be to miss the moment everything turned from bad to worse. Holmes reached the end of the sworn statement, and for a heartbeat there was only the fire and the rain tapping faintly at the glass. "You see," Phipps said quickly, as if he could not bear the silence to collect itself, why Mr. Finch, believes it best you are involved. The family is respected, there are reputations, there is property, and if it becomes public that a man vanished from a locked room." Holmes lifted a finger, not to silence him, but to stop him from talking himself into panic. "You said there was something else." Phipps's throat worked. He reached into his coat and produced another folded paper. This one was thinner, but the way he held it suggested it weighed more. "This," he said, "is a document filed this morning, part of the settlement, routine, except," he swallowed, "except it bears Mr. Ashdown's signature, dated the morning after he vanished." Holmes took the paper. He did not read it at once. He looked instead at the silver watch, resting quietly on the table, its hands frozen as though time itself had been bribed to stand still. Holmes's voice, when it came, was almost kind. "Very well, Mr. Phipps, tell Mr. Finch that I accept, and tell Mrs. Harrow," he paused, and his eyes sharpened, "that if she has sworn a thing once, she must be prepared to live inside it until we find the seam." Phipps rose, relief and dread mixing on his face like rain and soot. As Mrs. Hudson escorted him out, the door clicked shut with a finality that felt like a judge's gavel. Holmes turned the watch once more in his fingers, and the firelight slid along the case like a secret unwilling to be seen. If the man truly vanished, who signed the document, and why would a household risk perjury to prove it? That question rode with us through the fog, sitting between us like a third passenger. Holmes tucked the disputed paper into the inside pocket of his coat with the careful air of a man placing a razor where he might need it later. The silver watch, wrapped again in its brown paper, rested in his gloved hand as though it were not merely evidence but a living contradiction, warm in all the wrong places. London at that hour had the washed-out look of a city that had exhaled too long. Gas lamps floated in pale halos. The street's edges softened where mist swallowed stone. A carriage passed and left behind it the faint smell of damp wool and horse. Holmes said nothing for several turns, and I have learned that when he is quiet, he is not empty, he is arranging. Ashdown House sat in a street that prided itself on restraint. The houses were tall, narrow, and respectable, with curtains drawn as if modesty itself were a fabric. There was no noise beyond the distant clatter of hooves and the occasional cough of a passerby. It was the kind of neighborhood where people do not shout, they lean closer and ruin one another softly. We were admitted by a footman whose livery looked newly pressed, as if the household believed order could be ironed into place. The man's expression was polite and fixed, but his eyes held the faint wetness of a person who had not slept properly since something happened that could not be undone. "Mr. Holmes," he said, as though our names had been rehearsed. "Dr. Watson, this way if you please." Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of beeswax and coal. A fire burned somewhere deeper in the house. The walls carried paintings that watched without curiosity, their subjects long dead and too well bred to care who came and went. Everything was correct, too correct. It was the kind of correctness that does not soothe, it warns. Holmes removed his hat slowly, eyes moving not over grand things but over small ones. The mat by the door, scrubbed clean but still damp at the edges. The umbrella stand, containing 3 umbrellas all aligned in the same direction. The faint scuff marks on the baseboard where someone had paced without admitting it. "Do you feel it?" I murmured low, as the footman led us along a corridor. Holmes's gaze never left the details. "I smell it," he said, "fresh polish and old fear." We were ushered into a sitting room that attempted coziness as though it were a requirement rather than a comfort. A rug lay neatly aligned with the hearth. 2 chairs faced the fire at precisely matched angles. A tea service sat on a side table, cups and saucers spaced as evenly as chess pieces, each handle turned outward. Even the books on the shelves seemed staged, spines aligned, dusted, slightly too proud of their own titles. The woman who rose as we entered was young for a widow, and it showed in the way grief had not yet hardened into a permanent shape. Her black dress was proper, her collar high, her hair pinned with a severity that might have been self-protection. She moved with a steadiness that suggested she had been forced, repeatedly, to compose herself in front of men who expected her to collapse for their convenience. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," she said. Her voice was clear. It held the faint edge of someone who had learned to speak carefully so no one could twist her words. "I am Mrs. Viola Ashdown." Holmes bowed. "Madam." Her eyes flicked briefly to the parcel in his hand, and in that flicker I saw something, recognition perhaps, or the instinctive recall of someone who knows an object has become a weapon. A second man approached with a smile that arrived before sincerity. He was perhaps in his 30s, handsome in an easy way, with bright eyes and a manner that could make a stranger feel included. Yet the smile never touched his shoulders. His body held tension, an alertness that contradicted his charm. "Mr. Holmes, doctor," he offered his hand too readily. "Miles Ashdown, my stepbrother's affairs have fallen into unpleasant confusion. We are grateful you've come." Holmes shook his hand once lightly. "Gratitude is best reserved for endings, Mr. Ashdown." The smile faltered, then returned, thinner. Near the window stood a man with papers in his hands, thin shoulders, neat moustache, a solicitor's face trained into neutrality, but unable to conceal the tremor at the corner of his mouth. His eyes kept returning to the door, as though he hoped someone might re-enter and tell him he could stop being responsible. "Gerald Wickers," he said quickly, stepping forward. "Family solicitor, I have prepared." Holmes lifted a hand, not a rude interruption, a gentle refusal. "In due course, Mr. Wickers." And then half in shadow near the doorway, a maid. She could not have been more than 20. Her hands were clasped so tightly the knuckles shone. She looked at the carpet, then at Mrs. Ashdown, then away again, as though her gaze belonged to someone else. When Holmes's eyes passed over her, she stiffened, not with defiance but with fear. Holmes's voice softened by a fraction. "And you are?" "Lena Bristow, sir," she said, barely above a whisper. Mrs. Ashdown's chin lifted as if to shield the girl. Lena has served here since before my marriage, she said. She is loyal. Holmes's gaze lingered on the maid's hands. Loyalty is sometimes a chain, he murmured, and I saw the girl flinch at the word chain as though it had struck bone. Mrs. Ashdown gestured toward the chairs. Please, sit, Mrs. Harrow will join us. Almost as if summoned by her name, the housekeeper entered. She was older, broad-shouldered, with grey hair pinned back and eyes that had watched a lifetime of human weakness without losing their own sense of right and wrong. She carried no tray, no cloth, no domestic tool, only herself and the heavy dignity of someone who had decided she would not be dismissed. She looked at Holmes without blinking. You read it, she said. I did, Holmes replied. And exactly. Exactly. Something in her shoulders eased, but only slightly. Then you understand why I would not repeat it. Words get altered, not always by ink. Holmes nodded toward the sitting room. This is the room. Mrs. Harrow's jaw tightened. It is. Holmes moved into it as a man moves into a landscape. He did not hover by the center like a visitor. He went to the edges, window, hearth, door, testing the boundaries where lies tend to hide. He examined the latch with his fingers, gentle as a physician. He looked at the lock on the door, then at the keyhole, then at the faint scratches around it that suggested nervous handling. He spoke without looking up. Show me how it was found. Mrs. Harrow's eyes darted to Mrs. Ashdown, as if seeking permission. The widow held her gaze a moment, then gave the slightest nod. Mrs. Harrow crossed to the hearthrug and pointed to a spot near its edge. There, she said, just there, chains spread like something dropped. Holmes drew the silver watch from its wrapping and held it in his palm, letting the firelight catch its case. He did not set it down at once. Instead, he watched their faces as if the metal were a mirror reflecting guilt. Miles Ashdown's smile held, too well. Mr. Wickers licked his lips. Lena Bristow's gaze flicked to the watch and snapped away. Mrs. Ashdown's eyes stayed on it, steady, but the muscles around her mouth tightened until her lips whitened. Holmes stepped toward the window. The curtains were thick, the glass clean, the latch firm. He tested it, then leaned closer, eyes narrowing. No signs of forcing, he said. No loosened screws, no fresh scratches. He moved to the bell pull. It hung straight, still. He touched it and listened to the faint mechanical response in the wall beyond. A bell, but no call, he murmured. Then he went to the hearth. The grate was clean. The coal lay arranged neatly, as though someone took pride in the appearance of warmth. Holmes crouched and scraped a finger lightly over the stone near the base. A smudge of soot lifted onto his glove. He held it up, examined it, then rubbed it between finger and thumb with slow consideration. Doctor, he said without looking at me, do you smell anything? I leaned slightly forward. Beneath beeswax and coal was a faint sharpness, metallic, almost like oil, but not quite. It reminded me of workshops, of places where small mechanisms are born and repaired. A trace, I said, like machine oil. Holmes rose, his eyes turned to Mr. Wickers, who last commissioned a repair on this watch. The solicitor blinked too quickly. How would I know? It is an heirloom. It belonged to Mr. Reginald Ashdown. Holmes's gaze slid to Miles. And you, Mr. Ashdown, did your stepbrother mention repairs? Miles spread his hands, genial. Reginald was particular about his possessions, but he did not confide in me. We were not close. Not close, the phrase landed like a small stone in a still pond. It rippled outward. Mrs. Ashdown's eyes hardened. Mrs. Harrow's nostrils flared as if she had smelled hypocrisy. Holmes went to the door and closed it. Then he opened it again. The sound was ordinary, the click of latch, the whisper of wood. Yet in a case like this, even ordinary sounds become suspect. When you opened it, Holmes asked, who stood where? Mrs. Harrow answered at once. Mr. Wickers was nearest, Mr. Miles behind him, Mrs. Ashdown to the side. Lena, she was in the corridor. Lena's face went paler. I was. Mrs. Ashdown cut in smoothly. Lena was frightened. There had been shouting. It was not her place. Holmes turned to the maid, not harshly, but with a tension that made her shrink. Was it your place to bring the tea tray? Her hands tightened. Yes, sir. And did you bring it before or after the door was closed? Lena's lips parted, then pressed together. Her eyes went to Mrs. Ashdown, as if she needed the widow's face to tell her what truth was allowed. Answer him, Mrs. Harrow snapped, the first sharpness we'd heard from her. He's not one of them. Lena swallowed. Before, she whispered, before the door was closed. Holmes nodded slowly. And when you set it down, did you see the watch? Lena hesitated. The room held its breath with her. I think so, she said, on the mantel near the clock. Miles's smile twitched. Mr. Wickers shifted his papers as though he wished to hide behind them. Holmes's voice remained calm. So the watch was on the mantel before the door was closed, yet it was found on the rug after the room was opened. Mrs. Harrow's eyes flashed. That is what I said in the statement. Holmes stepped back toward the center of the room, gaze moving from face to face. Now, he said, and his tone was gentle in the way a scalpel is gentle, tell me who benefits if Mr. Reginald Ashdown is declared dead. The question was so softly spoken that for a second it seemed absurd, too polite to be dangerous. Then it sank and the room changed. It was as though the air had thickened. Miles laughed lightly, but it was a laugh that tried too hard. Benefits. Mr. Holmes, the man is missing. We're not discussing profit. Holmes's eyes stayed on him. Profit is often the most faithful companion of tragedy. Mr. Wickers cleared his throat. Legally, if Mr. Reginald Ashdown is declared deceased without issue, certain properties revert. Mrs. Ashdown's voice cut through, crisp. Enough. Her composure did not break, but it trembled at the edge, like glass under pressure. You speak as though my home is a ledger, she said, as though grief is merely a clause. Holmes inclined his head. I speak as though someone in your home has turned grief into a clause. The maid made a sound, half breath, half stifled sob. Mrs. Harrow's eyes softened for a moment toward her, then hardened again toward the others. I watched Mrs. Ashdown closely. Shame does not always look like guilt. Sometimes it looks like a person guarding a door because behind it is a room full of things the world would delight in judging. Holmes moved again, returning to the watch. He opened its case with a practiced flick. The hands were frozen, as Mrs. Harrow had sworn, at 17 minutes past 5. He held it close to his ear. The room was silent enough that I could hear the fire shifting. Then, faintly, a sound. Not the steady tick of mechanism. A double click. Soft, intentional, like a signal given in the dark. Holmes's eyes lifted at once, sharp as a turned blade. He looked around the sitting room, not at the furniture, but at the people, as if asking who among them had ever been trained to listen. Miles Ashdown's smile finally slipped. Mr. Wickers's hand tightened on his papers. Lena Bristow's breath caught so fast it sounded like fear. Holmes closed the watch gently and slipped it back into his palm as though it were fragile, though his gaze said the opposite. This watch is not simply stopped, he said quietly. It has been made to speak. And in the sudden awareness of that, of a timepiece turned into a messenger, the sitting room no longer felt staged for comfort. It felt staged for something else entirely, a performance designed to be overheard by the right person at the right moment. The watch's double click hung in the air like a question that could not be unsaid. If the watch had been made to speak, then somewhere in London there was someone trained to listen, and that meant the signal was not for the dead, but for the living. Holmes did not accuse anyone in that sitting room. He simply pocketed the watch again, as one might pocket a match before stepping into a dark corridor. The air in Ashdown House had turned delicate, brittle with the understanding that an object on the hearthrug was no longer an heirloom, but a message. Mrs. Ashdown remained upright, chin lifted, eyes steady, yet I saw the faint tremor in the fingers she kept pressed against the arm of her chair, a private effort to hold herself together. Miles Ashdown recovered his charm like a man smoothing a wrinkled cuff, smiling as though smiles could erase sounds. Mr. Wickers clung to his papers. Lena Bristow looked as if she were waiting for permission to breathe. Holmes spoke to them as if speaking of weather. Mrs. Harrow, your deposition was written with care. I shall require details you did not include, not because you lied, but because legal language cuts away the very fibers that reveal how a lie is spun. Mrs. Harrow's eyes hardened. Ask. Holmes turned to Mrs. Ashdown. Madam, you will forgive me if I treat your household like a ledger for a time. I am not indifferent to your dignity. I am, however, indifferent to the comfort of anyone who is using it. Mrs. Ashdown's voice was low and controlled. Mr. Holmes, my dignity is all that remains that is wholly mine. And that, Holmes said, is precisely why it is valuable to others. He asked for one thing only before we left, an item so mundane it seemed harmless. On the day your stepbrother vanished, he said, what was served with the tea? The room shifted. It was an innocent question. Tea is tea. The accompaniments are domestic trivia, the kind of thing only women and servants remember, the kind of detail no one believes matters until it does. Yet when Holmes asked it, two voices answered too quickly, as if a cue had been given. Seed cake, said Miles Ashdown. Seed cake, said Mr. Wickers. The words landed together, identical in tone and timing, like two actors hitting a line they had practiced in rehearsal. There was a pause afterward, half a heartbeat of silence in which both men realized they had revealed more by agreeing than by disagreeing. Mrs. Harrow's mouth tightened. Lena's eyes widened. Mrs. Ashdown did not move, but something changed in the set of her shoulders, a faint stiffening as though she had heard the snap of a thread. Holmes merely nodded, as if he had asked about the color of the wallpaper. Thank you, he said. A reliable household detail. We shall speak again. We stepped back into the fog. An Ashdown house closed behind us with a soft click that felt less like a door shutting and more like a mouth refusing to answer. Outside, the street lamp seemed farther away than before. Fog wrapped itself around the iron railings and the bare branches like gauze. Holmes walked without haste, but I recognized the stiffness in his posture that meant his mind was already ahead, following lines of ink and metal through the city. Seed cake, I murmured, once we were several houses away. Holmes did not look at me. Two men do not remember seed cake with the same cadence unless they have been told to. And told by whom? That, Holmes said, is what the city is for. He did not return to Baker Street. He turned instead toward the flow of London's working veins, toward the streets where men trade watches for rent, where watchmakers' fingers smell of oil, where solicitors file papers that can crush a life without raising a voice. We began, inevitably, with the object that had brought us there. Holmes took the silver watch out under a street lamp and opened it again, letting the light fall across its face. The hands remained frozen at 17 minutes past 5, as if the watch itself refused to admit that time moves on after certain moments. Holmes's thumb brushed the chain. The clasp caught slightly. There, he said. What? I leaned closer. The clasp, Holmes murmured. It hesitates. It is not a matched partner to this chain. Someone replaced it, and not long ago. A true heirloom keeps its scars consistent. He slipped the chain between finger and thumb, feeling for what eyes might miss. Then, very carefully, he pressed near the hinge of the case and listened. The faint double click answered him again. It was not the simple protest of a worn mechanism. It sounded like intention, like a signal designed to be heard by someone waiting for it. Holmes's gaze lifted toward the street, as though he could see the receiver of that signal in the fog itself. "We need the hands that touched this," he said, "and hands leave records." In London, records are not always written in official ledgers. Sometimes they are scratched into the memory of men who cannot raid, but can tell you exactly how much a silver case is worth on a rainy Thursday. Sometimes they are in the quiet notebooks behind pawnshop counters, where desperation is priced by weight. Holmes chose a pawnbroker's street with the instinct of a man who knows where shame goes when it needs money. The shop we entered smelled of damp wood and old metal. Watches lay in a glass case like captured time. Rings waited with dull patience, stripped of their stories. A bell tinkled as we stepped in, and a man behind the counter looked up with the cautious friendliness of someone who has seen too many faces arrive hopeful and leave humiliated. Holmes did not announce himself. He rarely did. He asked questions with the ease of a man buying groceries. "Any silver watches brought in recently?" he said, leaning just enough to seem casual. "An heirloom, perhaps, fine case, English make." The pawnbroker's eyes sharpened. "We get a dozen a week," he said. "From clerks and drunkards and widows before rent day. You'll need more than that." Holmes smiled faintly. "A repaired clasp," he said. "A newer clasp on an older chain, and it makes a sound it should not make." The pawnbroker's gaze flicked to the watch in Holmes's hand, then away. "Sounds cost extra," he said, but his tone had shifted. He knew now that Holmes was not a buyer, but a man hunting the story behind the metal. Holmes did not push. He did not threaten. He simply let a coin rest on the counter, not as a bribe, but as a polite acknowledgement of time spent. "The last month," he said, "perhaps under a false name." The pawnbroker's mouth tightened as he thought. He nodded once slowly. "There was one," he admitted. "Not pawned. Shown. Asked what it would fetch. A fellow came in, clean enough to pretend he wasn't desperate. Said it belonged to his uncle, but his eyes kept measuring the door, like he expected someone to walk in behind him." Holmes's gaze did not waver. "Describe him." "Dark coat, neat gloves. Solicitors sought," the man said, "or someone who wanted to look like one. He didn't sell, just asked, and left." Holmes's voice remained level. "And did he mention a watchmaker?" The pawnbroker hesitated. "He asked if I knew anyone who could alter the inside without marking the outside," he said at last. "I told him about Mercer's off Clerkenwell. They do strange requests if you pay." Holmes thanked him, and we were out again, swallowed by fog and gaslight, moving toward Clerkenwell, where the streets smelled of ironwork and industry. The city grew louder there, hammers, carts, men calling. A different London, one less polished and more honest, where secrets are not hidden behind curtains but behind closed workshop doors. Mercer's was a narrow shop with a crooked sign and a window full of gears that caught the light like insect wings. Inside, the air was warm with oil and brass. The man at the bench looked up slowly, eyes narrowed by years of focusing on tiny things. His fingers were stained dark with work. Holmes held the watch out without ceremony. The watchmaker's gaze fixed on it with something like reverence, then with suspicion. "That's not come to be claimed," he said. "No," Holmes replied, "it has come to be understood." The watchmaker took it carefully, turned it over, listened, pressed near the hinge. The double click sounded again, and his brows rose despite himself. "Someone else added a little trick," he murmured. A spring catch, not factory, not standard. How recently? Holmes asked. The watchmaker sniffed as though scent could date metal. Recent enough that the oil inside hasn't dried, he said, but not fresh. A week, 2, hard to say, depends how it was stored. Holmes's eyes sharpened. And under what name was the repair ordered? The watchmaker hesitated, then went to a shelf and pulled down a small notebook. He flipped pages, lips moving silently as he read, then jabbed a finger at a line. Mr. H. Caro, he said, paid cash, wanted the clasp changed too, said it had broken, but the chain's older than the clasp, you see, that's odd. Holmes's expression did not change, but I felt the case tighten in his hands. Harrow, he murmured. It's not Harrow, I said quietly, Caro. False name, Holmes replied, close enough to a real one to feel safe. The watchmaker glanced up, reading the danger in Holmes's calm. If this is trouble, he said, I don't want it. Holmes's voice softened. You will have none, he said. Unless you lie to me, tell me, was there anything else, any instruction, any mention of timing? The watchmaker looked down again, then back up. He asked if it could be made to stop at a particular minute, he said, and if it could be made to click twice when pressed, like a signal. He said it was for a demonstration. A demonstration, Holmes repeated, and the word tasted bitter. We left Mercer S with the name written in Holmes's mind, if not in any legal record. The watch had been altered, the clasp replaced, a false name used, a signal installed. Every piece of it suggested intention, not accident, and intention has a shape, it belongs to a person. Holmes turned from Clerkenwell toward Chancery Lane, where law lives in narrow corridors and men in black coats carry other people's fates like briefcases. As we walked, he spoke as if arranging pieces on an invisible board. The locked room may be genuine, he said, but the watch is not. When an object is manipulated, it is manipulated for a reason. The question is whether the reason is to escape or to ensnare. And the signature, I asked. Holmes's eyes flicked to me. Ink can lie more elegantly than flesh. We will see who teaches it. Chancery Lane in daylight has a different kind of gloom. Not fog and soot, but paper and old stone, corridors that swallow voices and offices that smell of sealing wax. Finch and Roper's chambers were tidy, polished, respectable, the kind of respectability that makes it hard for people to believe crimes can occur there at all. Edwin Phipps met us with the strained relief of a man who has been waiting for a doctor to arrive at a sick bed. He ushered us into a small office, where Mr. Oliver Finch sat behind a desk, his hair grey at the temples, his eyes sharp with professional fatigue. Holmes did not sit at once. He placed the watch, still wrapped, on the desk as though placing a question. Finch's gaze dropped to it and returned to Holmes's face. You found something? Finch asked. Holmes's voice was mild. I found that this watch has been recently altered under the name H. Caro. Finch's eyes narrowed. I don't know the name. No, Holmes said, but you know Harrow. Finch's mouth tightened. Mrs. Harrow is a respectable woman, he said quickly. I have known her statement to be earnest. Earnestness is not evidence, Holmes replied. It is merely the tone in which a person chooses to lie or to tell the truth. Finch's hands folded on the desk, too neatly. The solicitor's performance of calm felt like Mr. Wickers's, correct, rehearsed, as if the law itself were a mask. Holmes's gaze moved to the paper I had seen earlier, the one bearing the impossible signature. Show me the document filed this morning. Finch hesitated a fraction of a second too long, then slid it across. Holmes read it quickly, eyes moving with effortless speed. He did not comment on its content at first. He simply looked at the signature, then at the date, then at Finch. "Where was this signed?" Holmes asked. "In our chambers," Finch said. "Yesterday afternoon, before the incident." Holmes's eyes did not blink. "Then why is it dated the morning after the incident?" Finch's jaw tightened. "A clerical matter," he said. "The date of filing, not signing." "A convenient confusion," Holmes murmured. "Mr. Finch, your clerk told me the household is respectable. So are you. Respectability, I find, is often the prettiest wrapper for wrongdoing." Finch's eyes flashed. "Mr. Holmes." Holmes lifted a hand. "Do not take offense," he said quietly. "It will not help you." It was then that Holmes did something subtle. He asked about the deposition, about its delivery, its seal, its handling. Finch answered smoothly, too smoothly. Each reply arrived with the same measured cadence, like lines learned. Holmes watched him for a long moment, then shifted his gaze to Phipps. "Mr. Phipps," he said, "when Mrs. Harrow gave her deposition, did she carry anything besides the paper?" Phipps blinked. "She had a small bundle," he said slowly. "A second packet, tied." Finch's eyes flicked toward him, fast, sharp, warning, and then returned to Holmes with forced calm. Holmes's voice remained mild. "And what became of that second packet?" Phipps swallowed. "Mr. Finch took it," he said. "He said it was irrelevant. He said it was not to be filed." Finch's mouth tightened. "It contained household nonsense," he said quickly. "Rambling, emotional detail. Mrs. Harrow is an old woman, she." Mrs. Harrow's voice in my memory cut through. "Housekeepers are archivists. They keep fibers." Holmes leaned forward slightly, the first true pressure he had applied in that office. "An unfiled packet," he said softly. "A second deposition, perhaps, or an addendum. Something that does not fit the story you prefer." Finch's face held its professional shape, but his eyes had changed. The performance was still there, yet behind it fear. Holmes straightened. "We will obtain it," he said. Finch's smile attempted to return, thin and legal. "On what grounds?" Holmes's gaze was cold. "On the grounds that someone has altered a watch, rehearsed testimony, and filed a document that makes time itself a liar." Finch's hands tightened on the desk edge, then relaxed. He said nothing more. We left Finch and Roper with no second packet in hand, but with certainty in Holmes's eyes. The law had been used here not as a lantern, but as a curtain. And curtains, when drawn too tightly, reveal their shape. As we stepped back into the street, Holmes turned toward me without slowing. "Doctor," he said, "you will return to Ashdown House. Speak to the maid alone, not in the sitting room, not under the widow's gaze. Find her where servants breathe, near the kitchen, where fear has less space to posture." "And you?" "I will walk where ink pretends to be innocent," Holmes said. "There are men in Chancery Lane who know more than they admit, and there is a name in a watchmaker's book that leads somewhere." He paused, and the faintest warmth entered his voice. Not sentiment, but a storyteller's instinct for the moment. A listener leans closer. "If you want more stories where the truth is earned, not guessed, stay with me. Because the next thread we pulled was not made of metal or paper, but of a young woman's silence." I returned to Ashdown House under the excuse of retrieving a forgotten detail for Mr. Holmes. Mrs. Harrow met me near the back passage, suspicion in her eyes. When I asked for Lena, she hesitated, then nodded and led me not to the sitting room but to a narrow corridor near the kitchen. The air smelled of bread and boiled water. A kettle hissed softly. Here the house felt less staged, more human. Lena stood by a table, hands busy with a cloth she did not truly clean. When she saw me, her shoulders stiffened. Mrs. Harrow gave her one sharp look and left us alone. Lena's voice was barely there. "Did I do wrong?" she whispered. I chose my words carefully. You are frightened, I said. That does not make you wrong, it makes you trapped. Her eyes filled quickly, and she blinked hard as though tears were another debt she could not afford. I want to help Mrs. Ashdown, she said, the devotion in her voice raw. She's been good to me. She made sure my brother got his medicine when my mother couldn't pay. And Mr. Miles, I asked softly. Her hands stopped moving. The cloth froze in her grip. He helped, she said, and the word was poisoned. He said he helped. He paid something for my family. But then he said I must remember it, that I must be grateful. Grateful, the same word he had offered Holmes, too soon, too easily. What did he ask of you? I said. Lena shook her head quickly, panic rising. Nothing, she said too fast. Nothing, only to do my work, to carry tea, to say what I saw, to remember what I must remember. Her eyes darted toward the corridor, as though Miles might appear out of fog, even here. Lena, I said, when you carried the tea tray into the sitting room, was the watch on the mantel? As she swallowed, yes. And when you left, was the door shut behind you? Yes, she whispered. Mr. Reginald shut it. He didn't look at me. He looked at Mrs. Ashdown like he was ashamed. And after it was opened, I said gently, you were in the corridor. Did you hear anything? Her breath hitched. I heard a sound, she said. Not a voice, not shouting, a little click, like when Mr. Miles closes his snuff box. The words settled with quiet weight. A click, a signal, and Miles with a snuff box, a habit of small mechanisms in his fingers. Lena's eyes went to mine, pleading. I don't want to ruin her, she whispered. If people talk, if London talks, she'll never be free. I believed her. That was the cruelest part. She feared scandal more than she feared lies, because scandal would devour Mrs. Ashdown whole, while the men who created it would walk away with clean gloves. I placed my hand lightly on the table, not touching hers, but steadying the space between us. You will not ruin her by telling the truth, I said. You will ruin her by letting others write it for you. Her breath shook. For a moment, I thought she might speak fully. Then footsteps sounded somewhere beyond the corridor, and Lena recoiled as if struck. Please, she whispered, don't make me say it, not yet. The fear returned to her face like a door slamming shut. When I left Ashdown House again, the fog felt sharper, as if it had learned something. I carried Lena's fragment of truth back through London, knowing Holmes would take it and turn it into pressure, carefully, precisely, until the household's rehearsed story began to crack. A watch altered under a false name, a clasp replaced, two men reciting the same phrase like actors, a maid bound by a help that sounded like a debt, and somewhere in a solicitor's office, a second packet kept out of sight. The locked room might be real. But time, I now understood, had been arranged. If the heirloom was partly replaced, then the question that followed us back to Baker Street was sharper than the fog itself. What else had been exchanged that night? An object, a document, or a person? Holmes listened to my account of Lena Bristow's trembling loyalty without interrupting, his gaze fixed on the fire as though the flames were rearranging the facts for him. When I spoke of Miles's help, of gratitude turned into a chain, Holmes's fingers moved once, an almost invisible tightening, the smallest sign of disgust. When I told him about the click Lena compared to a snuff box, Holmes's eyes lifted at last, bright with that cold, delighted attention he reserves for the moment an emotional detail becomes mechanical truth. He did not go to bed. He never went to bed when a case had begun to breathe. By morning, London's fog had thinned but not lifted, leaving the streets washed in grey light like an old photograph. Holmes insisted we return to Ashdown House at an hour when the household would be least prepared, late morning, when servants are busiest and the respectable believe themselves safest. We were admitted again by the same footman, who looked more exhausted than the day before, as though he had spent the night listening for footsteps that never came. Mrs. Harrow met us in the corridor, her face set in the stubborn, bruised patience of a woman guarding a line. She led us not to the sitting room at first, but to a smaller parlour, less grand, used for quiet calls, an in-between space. The air smelled faintly of lavender water and something sharper underneath, like stress. Mrs. Viola Ashdown entered a moment later. She moved as if she had chosen each step. In daylight she looked younger than her black dress suggested, too young to have learned the art of widowhood so quickly. Yet she wore it like armor, her grief arranged and pinned into place. She did not offer her hand. She offered her eyes, steady and unblinking, daring anyone to misunderstand her. "Mr. Holmes," she said. "Mrs. Ashdown," Holmes replied. His tone held respect but not softness. Respect in his voice is simply accuracy. Miles Ashdown arrived behind her, and with him that same easy charm, the smile that tried to erase the tension in the room by pretending it was not there. Mr. Wickers followed, papers in hand as always, as though paper were a talisman against chaos. Lena stood near the doorway, hands clasped, gaze lowered, her body drawn tight like a cord that might snap if pulled. Holmes observed them all, and then did something unexpected. He did not address Miles. He did not address Wickers. He turned his full attention to the widow, as if she were not the household's ornament or its victim, but its center of gravity. "Madam," he said, "yesterday everyone spoke around you. Today I would prefer to speak to you." Mrs. Ashdown's chin lifted a fraction. "Men often speak around me," she said coolly. "It saves them the trouble of hearing my answer." Holmes's gaze did not flinch. "Then allow me the trouble." Mr. Wickers cleared his throat, already preparing to mediate. "Mr. Holmes, perhaps." Holmes glanced at him once. The glance was not cruel, it was simply final. Wickers fell silent. Holmes sat, not in the most comfortable chair, but in one that gave him a clear view of the door, the widow, and the space between. I have seen him choose seats the way generals choose hills. "You answered my question yesterday with the precision of a solicitor," Holmes said to Mrs. Ashdown, "yet you are not one." Mrs. Ashdown's mouth tightened. Living beside solicitors teaches a woman language, whether she wishes to learn it or not. "Indeed," Holmes said, "and living beside men who fear scandal teaches her restraint." Her eyes sharpened. "You speak as though scandal is my natural state." Holmes's voice remained calm. "I speak as though scandal is the lever they will use against you, because it is the only lever they believe works." Miles's laugh came too quickly, too light. "Surely, Holmes, we need not." Holmes did not look at him. He continued speaking to the widow, and the effect was like a door closing in Miles's face. Charm is useless when no one acknowledges it. "Your husband's estate," Holmes went on, "was recently settled. Your household became tense. People began to rehearse their answers. A watch was altered under a false name and made to signal like a messenger, and then a man vanished from a locked room." Mrs. Ashdown's gaze did not move, but the muscles in her throat flexed as she swallowed. "You recite facts," she said softly. "Facts are not always the same as truth." Holmes nodded, agreed, "So let us talk about truth as it is lived, not in ink." He rose and walked past her without hurry, crossing the room toward the door. "I would like to see the sitting room again." Mrs. Harrow's eyes flicked to the widow. Mrs. Ashdown held her gaze for a heartbeat, then gave the smallest nod. Permission granted, not to be investigated, but to be understood. They led us back into the sitting room where the locked room miracle had been staged. In daylight, the room looked less theatrical and more disturbing. The carefully placed objects seemed almost desperate. The tea service had been removed, but the side table remained in its precise position, like an actor left behind after a scene change. Holmes went straight to the hearthrug. He crouched, gloved fingers hovering above the spot where Mrs. Harrow had pointed yesterday. Then he did not look at the rug at all. He looked at the floor beneath its edge, where the fibers were thinner and less protected from scrutiny. With the edge of a knife, small, clean, carried always, he lifted a corner of the rug no more than an inch. "Mrs. Harrow," he said, "you cleaned this room after the incident." Mrs. Harrow's jaw set. Of course, a room does not remain as it was. Holmes's voice softened slightly, acknowledging the human instinct to erase. Naturally, but cleaning removes the obvious. It does not always remove the honest. He tapped the exposed floor lightly, then drew his glove back and examined the fingertip. Not blood, not ash. A pale powder clung to the leather, gritty between his fingers when he rubbed it. It had a faint crystalline sheen, the sort of residue that does not come from fireside coal or household dust. Holmes inhaled once, gently, as though smelling it might tell him its history. His eyes narrowed in that attentive way that always made me think of a man reading invisible print. "This," he murmured, "is not from this room." Mrs. Ashdown's voice was controlled, but a note of strain crept in. "What is it?" Holmes held up his gloved hand. "A powdery grit, not ash, not plaster. It has the texture of riverfront work, warehouse floors, where sacks are dragged and crates are shifted and fine residue settles into boards." Miles's smile faltered just slightly. "Riverfront," he said, and the word came out too sharp for someone merely curious. Holmes's gaze flicked to him at last, and the look was almost gentle, almost pitying, because Miles had revealed himself without being touched. "Ah," Holmes said softly, "that word troubles you." Miles recovered quickly. "It troubles me only because it is nonsense," he said, but his shoulders had tightened, the charm now strained at the seams. Holmes stood, brushing his hands as if the grit were an insult. "Nonsense often becomes sense when one stops trying to protect it," he replied. He turned toward Lena, who had remained near the doorway, small and pale against the wallpaper. "Miss Bristow," he said. Lena's head lifted a fraction. Her eyes were wide, wary. "How long have you polished the family silver?" Holmes asked. Lena blinked, confused by the question. Since I began, sir." "And this watch," Holmes said, drawing the silver watch out again, "have you polished it?" Lena's breath caught, her hands clasped tighter until her knuckles whitened. "Yes, sir," she whispered. Holmes's voice stayed mild, but the room seemed to tighten around the question. Was it always like this? Lena's eyes flicked to Mrs. Ashdown, then to Miles, then back to the watch. It was a silver watch," she said, as though that were the safest answer. Holmes leaned slightly closer. Was the clasp always the same? Lena's throat worked. She swallowed. "No," she whispered, barely audible. "No, sir, I don't think so." Miles took a step forward too quickly. "Really, Holmes, this is absurd. The girl is." Holmes turned his head toward him, and the movement was so small yet so precise it felt like a blade turning in a lock. "You will not instruct her in my presence," he said quietly. "You have already instructed enough people." Miles's mouth opened, then closed. His charm faltered completely for a moment, revealing something underneath, anger or fear or both. Holmes returned his gaze to Lena. "You said you heard a click," he said, "like a snuff box." Lena froze. I saw the conflict in her, the love for Mrs. Ashdown, the fear of Miles, the shame of being forced to choose. Tears rose, but she fought them down, because tears are a kind of confession in houses like this. Mrs. Ashdown's voice cut in, sharp with control. "Lena is exhausted," she said. This is cruel." Holmes did not look away. "Cruelty," he said, "is when a young woman is made to carry someone else's lie as if it were her own." Mrs. Ashdown's face flickered. For the first time, the composure cracked not into tears, but into something more dangerous, anger. She stepped forward, shoulders rigid. "Do you think I do not know that?" she snapped, and the room fell silent at the sound of her voice, because it was the first time she had allowed herself to be heard without polishing the edges. "Do you think I do not feel the weight of every whisper that has already begun outside these walls? I cannot step into the street without imagining the headlines they would write if they knew what they suspect." Her eyes flashed, and though she did not raise her voice further, the fury in it made the air tremble. "My husband died and left me with a name that belongs to everyone but me. Men come into my home and speak of estates and clauses while staring at my mourning dress as if it is a costume they might tug apart. And now my stepbrother." She stopped, breath shaking, eyes locked on Miles. "Now my stepbrother smiles at me and speaks of family, while the city waits to decide what kind of widow I am allowed to be." Miles's face had gone pale beneath his charm. "Viola," he began, warning threaded through the softness. "Careful." The word careful landed like a hand, closing around her throat. Mrs. Ashdown turned back to Holmes and her voice dropped, shaking with rage controlled too long. "You want truth? Fine, here is one truth. I have been threatened, not with knives, not with violence, with something far more precise." She lifted her chin and tears finally came, not spilling, not collapsing, but shining in her eyes like a weapon she refused to lower. "With ruin, with being made a spectacle, with being turned into a story men tell over brandy, laughing softly. If I refuse to cooperate, they will ensure London discovers something about me, something they can twist, something they can file and print and repeat until it becomes who I am." A shudder moved through Lena, as if the widow's words had freed a trapped breath. Holmes's expression changed. It was subtle, but it mattered. The cold edge softened, not into sentiment, but into understanding. He stepped closer to Mrs. Ashdown, not invading her space, but making the room feel less crowded by men. "Madam," he said gently, "someone is using your reputation as the lock on the door." Mrs. Ashdown's breath hitched, and for a moment, the anger faltered into something raw: fear, humiliation, exhaustion. Holmes continued, voice low enough that it felt almost private despite the witnesses. "If we treat this as merely a puzzle, you will remain trapped inside it. If we treat it as what it is, a mechanism built from shame and paperwork, then we can find the hand that built it." Miles's laughter returned, but now it sounded brittle. "Holmes, you always did enjoy melodrama." Holmes's gaze lifted to him, calm and lethal. "No," he said, "I enjoy mechanisms, and yours is beginning to slip." Miles's eyes flicked just once toward the window, toward the street beyond, toward the city, toward escape. Then back again, too quickly. Holmes brushed a speck of grit from his glove and held it up. "Riverfront warehouses," he said, as though speaking of something inevitable. "The sort of place a gentleman does not mention in polite rooms unless he has reason." Miles's mouth tightened. "I have no dealings with warehouses." Holmes tilted his head. "Then you will not object if I mention the river police," he said casually. "They are quite diligent when it comes to missing men and odd parcels. I should think they would enjoy a stroll through your no dealings." For the first time, Miles's charm cracked openly. His smile vanished. A flush rose along his throat. His eyes narrowed with a flash of genuine irritation, then, just beneath it, panic. Mrs. Harrow inhaled sharply, as if she had been waiting for that crack all along. Mr. Wickers's papers shook slightly. "Mr. Holmes," he said quickly, "perhaps we can keep this within private channels. There are reputations." Holmes's eyes cut to him. "Reputations are precisely why it cannot remain private," he said. "Private is where this was built." Lena made a small sound. half sob, half relief. Mrs. Ashdown stared at Holmes as if seeing, for the first time, the possibility of a door opening. Holmes reached into his pocket and, without display, closed his fingers around the watch. The faint double-click sounded again, softer now, like a heartbeat. His gaze went to the hearthrug, to the grit, to the window, to Miles, and then back to the widow. "You are not the suspect I came to interrogate," he said to her. "You are the witness they have tried to silence." Mrs. Ashdown's jaw trembled. "If the truth comes out," she whispered, "they will still talk." Holmes's voice was quiet. "Let them," he said. "Talking is all they have. We will have the facts." As we left Ashdown House again, the air outside felt colder, as if the fog had sharpened its attention. Holmes walked beside me with that restless stillness that meant his mind was already beyond the street, beyond the house, beyond the safe world of drawing rooms. He held the grit between his fingers like a compass point. If someone was using the widow's reputation as the lock, then the river, grey, patient, and unjudging, felt like the place where the key would be hidden. We reached the embankment under a sky the colour of wet slate. The air changed as we drew nearer to the water, less perfume and coal, more damp rope, tar, and the cold metallic breath of commerce. Here London did not pretend to be polite. It worked, it hauled, it bargained, it disposed. Fog gathered low over the river and moved in slow sheets, as though the Thames itself exhaled secrets and the city chose not to inhale too deeply. Holmes walked with his collar turned up and his eyes half-lidded, the way he does when he is listening for the city's smallest signals. The grit he'd found under the hearthrug sat in a folded scrap of paper in his pocket, treated with more care than most men treat their own letters. It had become our compass point, pointing away from drawing-room lies toward the rough edges where those lies were manufactured. The Riverside warehouse district revealed itself in layers. First, the outlines of buildings, tall, rectangular shadows with windows like blind eyes. Then the sounds, chains clinking, a distant shout, the slow creak of a cart. Then closer, the human presence. Men in caps with hands cracked by work, boys darting between stacks of crates, figures leaning in doorways with the stillness of watchers who have chosen a position and a price. We did not walk into the heart of it like naive gentlemen. Holmes guided us along the edges first, letting the district declare itself. He paused by a wall where pale residue had gathered at the base, scraped from sacks and dragged timber. He crouched, touched it, rubbed it between finger and thumb, then compared it to the grit we carried. "The same family," he murmured. "Not identical, but close enough to suggest travel." "Travel of what?" I asked. Holmes's gaze lifted to the nearest warehouse door, where a man stood smoking, watching us without curiosity but with assessment. "Travel of people who bring a little of this place with them," Holmes said. "On boots, on hems, on the cuff that brushes a crate. It is a district that marks those who move through it." We continued. At a narrow alley between two warehouses, Holmes stopped again, not because he saw something, but because he heard an absence. The alley was too quiet. Quiet here was unnatural. It meant someone had decided to keep it quiet. A figure emerged from that quiet, a man of middle height, coat decent but not fine, a hat pulled low. His face was not memorable in any obvious way, and that too was a kind of craft. The men who do certain work in London learn to look like nobody, because nobody is rarely questioned. He glanced at Holmes, and then at me, eyes quick, appraising. He spoke first, not with threats, but with the casual familiarity of someone used to dealing in things that must not be recorded. "You're far from Baker Street," he said. Holmes's expression did not change. "And you are far from honest employment, Mr. Devereux." The man's mouth twitched. "Still got your little birds, then?" Holmes had many such contacts, men who lived in the margins, not quite criminal, not quite respectable, moving between both worlds with the agility of survival. Devereux was one of them, a broker of information, a man who could tell you where certain goods were fenced and where certain men were hiding, not because he cared for truth, but because truth was a currency. Holmes took out the silver watch, still wrapped, and showed him the edge of it just enough for the metal to catch the light. Devereux's eyes sharpened. "Pretty," he said softly. "It has been made to stop," Holmes replied, "and to signal." Devereux's gaze flicked to the fog behind us, as though checking who might overhear. "Signals are not new," he said. "Men have always needed ways to say 'done' without speaking." Holmes's voice stayed mild. "Then you know this particular language." Devereux hesitated, then nodded once. "I know a bit," he admitted. "There are fellows who do errands, quiet errands, things that can't be written down. Sometimes the only proof they can give their employer is time. A watch stopped at a minute, a handkerchief knotted twice, a coin left upright on a windowsill." Holmes's eyes narrowed. A watch stopped at a minute as a receipt. Devereux's mouth tightened in a grim smile. "That's one way to put it," he said. "You stop it at the agreed time and you show it later. 5:17. Task done. No names, no words, just a minute that becomes a signature." Holmes held the watch a fraction higher, and the double click. Devereux made a faint sound in his throat. "That's a little flourish," he said. "Means there's someone waiting, someone who needs to know when to move, like a cue in a play." "A play," the word returned, echoing Mrs. Harrow's dreadful instinct. A household turned into theatre, a locked room as stagecraft, a watcher's cue. Holmes's voice tightened. Who would commission such a device? Devereux's eyes slid away. "Gentlemen," he said, "not the kind you'd expect, the kind who want things kept quiet, or the kind who want something to look like it wasn't them." Holmes stepped slightly closer, not threatening but inevitable. "A man vanished from a locked room," he said. "A widow is being threatened with ruin. A solicitor is rehearsing his answers. A stepbrother's charm cracks when the river is mentioned. And a watch has been altered under a false name. I am not here to admire your district, Mr. Devereux. I am here because the river knows something the parlors do not." Devereux exhaled, smoke curling from his lips like a slow confession. "There's talk," he said at last, "about a deal gone sideways. Not a big one, not money and guns, more papers. A man named Reginald Ashdown came down here a handful of times, not dressed for it, but careful, like he didn't want his boots to touch the wrong puddle." My chest tightened. "Reginald was here." Devereux nodded. "Saw him with a fellow who calls himself Clark. Not your kind of Clark." He smiled thinly at Holmes. "Different sort. Runs messages between firms that don't want to be seen together." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Which firm?" Devereux's gaze went distant as he searched his memory like a pocket. "Haskett and Vale," he said finally. "They do clean work, not preventing scandals, cleaning them, keeping names out of papers, keeping certain ladies from becoming headlines." Mrs. Ashdown's anger rose in my mind again, the threat of being made a spectacle, not by violence but by narrative. Holmes's voice was low. "Haskett and Vale," he repeated as though tasting it. "And this Clark, what does he look like?" Devereux shrugged. "Not much. That's the point. Grey, neat, eyes like a man counting. If I saw him in a church, I'd forget him by the door." Holmes nodded slightly. "And where would such men meet?" Devereux glanced down the street, toward a warehouse with a faded sign and a door that looked too well kept for the grime around it. "Sometimes there," he said. "Sometimes in the back of a coffee house near Wapping. Warm enough for deals, quiet enough for secrets." Holmes tucked the watch away again. "Thank you," he said, and made to move. Devereux's hand lifted, stopping him. "Careful," he murmured. "You're pulling on something that ain't just criminal. It's polite, and polite men don't like being dragged into the river mud." Holmes's eyes met his, calm, unmoved. "Then we shall disappoint them." We left Devereux behind and moved deeper into the warehouse district, and I felt the tension shift in my chest, not the sharp fear of physical threat, but the colder dread of social machinery. A knife can be dodged. A scandal cannot. It follows, it repeats, it gets printed, it gets believed. Holmes stopped near the warehouse Devereux had indicated. He did not rush toward it. He watched it, letting the fog reveal its patterns. A cart arrived. 2 men unloaded sacks, their movements practiced. A third man emerged briefly, glanced up and down the street, then disappeared again. The door shut softly, almost respectfully, as though even the wood knew it must not draw attention. Holmes's gaze drifted to a narrow side street. "We will not go in," he said. "Not yet. First, we confirm who is moving." "How?" I asked. He gave me a look that suggested the question was charming. "By letting them forget they are being watched." We waited. Time in that district moved differently. Minutes stretched, thick with damp and noise. The river kept its slow, indifferent rhythm. Men shouted, laughed, argued, loaded, carried on. And then, after nearly half an hour, I saw him. Miles Ashstone. He did not arrive like a man sneaking. He arrived like a man who believed himself entitled to move anywhere, even here. His coat was darker than the workers', his hat finer, yet he attempted a casualness that did not belong. He paused at the corner, glanced toward the river, then toward the warehouse door. His smile was absent now. His face had taken on the sharper look of purpose. A second figure approached him, a man in a plain coat with a neat satchel, steps measured, posture careful. He looked like a clerk, not the ink-stained kind, but the kind who carries messages that must never be filed. Miles spoke to him briefly. I could not hear the words, but I could see the rhythm. Miles leaning in, the clerk listening without reacting, then a slight nod. The clerk produced a folded paper. Miles took it, tucked it inside his coat, and for a moment his shoulders relaxed as if something had been handed over that steadied him. Holmes watched without moving. The clerk turned away and walked toward the coffeehouse Devereux had mentioned, near Wapping. Miles hesitated, then followed. Holmes's voice was low. "There is your key," he murmured. "Not in the watch alone, but in the chain of men who pass papers like contraband." We followed at a distance, letting the fog cover us like a curtain. The coffeehouse was the sort that pretends to serve warmth but truly serves privacy. Its windows were clouded with steam. Inside, the air was thick with roasted beans and damp coats. Men sat close, shoulders hunched, voices low. A few glanced up as we entered, then looked away quickly, as though refusing to acknowledge the risk of strangers. Miles and the clerk sat in a corner where the light was poorest. They spoke again. The clerk slid another paper across the table. Miles's fingers touched it with a familiarity that made my stomach tighten. This was not his first time. He looked briefly like a man used to buying silence. Holmes did not approach. He observed the angle of Miles's shoulders, the way his gaze kept flicking to the door, the slight impatience in his hand when the clerk lingered on a point. Then Holmes shifted his attention to the clerk's satchel. "Leather," he murmured, almost to himself. "Not cheap, firm stitching. A professional instrument. It has seen many hands." He leaned slightly toward me. "Doctor, you will remember this face," he said quietly, "even though it is designed to be forgotten." I studied the clerk as best I could. He truly was forgettable. Pale hair, plain features, eyes that held no warmth. He looked like a man who had trained himself never to carry guilt, only tasks. Miles rose first. The clerk remained seated a moment longer, finishing his coffee as though he had done nothing more than discuss weather. Then he stood and left by a side door, vanishing into the fog with the ease of a man who had practiced vanishing. Miles stepped out into the street again, and for a moment, alone in the grey light, he looked less like a genial stepbrother and more like what he was, a man holding a family's reputation in his fist, squeezing carefully. Holmes let him walk, then he moved. We did not follow Miles back to Ashdown House. Holmes turned away at a junction and led us toward a quieter street where offices hid behind respectable brass plates. "Hasket and Vale," he said. "We will not request entry. We will see who enters." And so we waited again, this time in a different kind of fog, one made of legality and discretion. Men walked in and out of buildings with papers tucked beneath arms, faces trained to neutrality. A carriage arrived, a gentleman stepped out, and the building swallowed him without fuss. The world of scandal cleaning operated like a digestive system, quiet, efficient, unseen unless one looked too closely. Holmes's patience was a weapon. After an hour, a familiar figure emerged, a junior clerk from Finch and Roper's orbit, not Phipps, but one I recognized from the corridors. He entered Hasket and Vale with the furtive speed of someone who knows he should not be seen there. He stayed only a short time, then left, satchel slightly fuller, shoulders tense. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Ink trades with ink," he murmured. "Influence trades with influence, and a widow pays the price." As afternoon drew on, my mind returned, unbidden, to Lena Bristow. Her devotion, her terror, the way she spoke of help as if it were a chain around her neck. Holmes, perhaps sensing my thoughts, spoke softly. "Go back," he said, "not to interrogate, to understand. The emotional engine is the lever here. Someone has built this mechanism out of fear. We must know whose fear is strongest." I returned to Ashdown House alone once more, under the pretext of checking on Mrs. Ashdown's well-being. Mrs. Harrow looked at me with suspicion, then, after a moment, let me pass. In the kitchen corridor, Lena stood by the stove, hands trembling as she poured hot water, the steam rising around her like a veil. When she saw me, her face tightened. "Is it worse?" she whispered. "It is clearer," I said gently, "and clarity feels worse before it feels better." Her hands shook harder. "I didn't mean," she swallowed. "I only meant to protect her." "Tell me how," I said, and kept my voice low, as if speaking too loudly might scare her back into silence. Lena stared at the cup in her hands as though it could answer. "Mr. Miles," she whispered, "he said Mrs. Ashdown was in danger. He said people would talk about her, about why she married Mr. Ashdown, about what she knew, about what she didn't." Her eyes filled. "He said if she didn't do what was needed, someone would make sure the wrong story was told." "And what was needed?" I asked. She flinched. "Just little things," she said. "A message carried, a paper brought upstairs, a word said to Mrs. Harrow, so she would write it, so it would be official." My stomach turned. "You told Mrs. Harrow what to write?" Lena shook her head quickly. No, she wrote her own words, but Mr. Miles said I should remind her of certain points, that the door was locked, that the key was fetched, that the watch was on the rug. He said those were important. He said if she forgot, the law would misunderstand." "And you believed him," I said softly. Tears slipped down her cheeks now, unguarded. "I did," she whispered, "because he said he helped my mother, because he said he could take that help away. Because he said I owed him gratitude." The word gratitude again. The same word Phipps had used. The same word men use when they want to turn kindness into ownership. Lena's voice broke. "I thought I was protecting Mrs. Ashdown," she said, sobbing now, shoulders shaking. "I thought I was keeping her safe from gossip. I didn't understand until you looked at me yesterday, until Mr. Holmes said it." She pressed the heel of her hand to her mouth, trying to swallow the sound. "I was building a cage with my own hands." I wanted to comfort her, yet I knew comfort too soon can feel like permission to stop. "Lena," I said gently, "do you know what was demanded of Mrs. Ashdown?" Lena's eyes flicked toward the corridor, fear returning. "No," she whispered, "not the whole. Only that she must sign something, that she must accept something, that she must cooperate. He said it was the only way to keep her name clean." "And Reginald Ashdown," I asked, "was he part of it?" Lena hesitated, then nodded miserably. He came to see Mr. Miles late at night, she whispered. Not often, but enough. They spoke in low voices. Once I heard Mr. Reginald say, "It will be done at the minute," like a promise. At the minute. My breath caught. The watch stopped at 5:17 like a receipt. When I returned to Holmes, dusk was gathering and the city lamps were blooming one by one, soft halos in the damp air. Holmes listened to Lena's confession without triumph. His face remained composed, but his eyes held that fierce pity he reserves for those crushed by machinery built by others. So the watch, I said, was proof, a receipt. Holmes nodded once. The warehouse minute, he murmured, a coded acknowledgement, a task completed at the agreed time. And the task, I asked. What did they do at 5:17? Holmes looked out toward the darkening river, where the fog thickened again, folding itself over the water like a shroud. Not murder, he said quietly. Not escape, something more precise. A disappearance staged to apply pressure. A signal sent to the correct receiver, confirming that the lever had been pulled. He turned to me then, and his voice lowered. Reginald Ashdown is not merely a victim, he said. He has been a participant, perhaps coerced, perhaps complicit, perhaps both. The inheritance settlement is the stage, and the private arrangement, guardianship, discretion, whatever polite word they have dressed it in, is the script. The case shifted in that moment. It grew colder, not because violence had appeared, but because we had found the true weapon. Paperwork sharpened into extortion, shame used as a blade, a watch turned into proof. A quick note: if these cases grip you, staying subscribed helps you catch the next one, because the truth is rarely found in the obvious place. It hides in the small agreements people make when they think no one is watching. Holmes's gaze returned to the silver watch in his hand. He pressed the hidden catch again. The double click sounded, small and deliberate, like a knock at a door no one wants opened. If the watch marked the minute of compliance, then the question was no longer who vanished, but what had been demanded, and which life would be sacrificed to keep that demand unspoken. Holmes carried that question the way other men carry a loaded pistol, not to brandish, but to remind himself what kind of harm he was dealing with. The river had given us its vocabulary, receipts without words, minutes that functioned as signatures, and Ashdown House, with its polished furniture and rehearsed grief, suddenly looked less like a home and more like a stage built to trap a woman inside a story. By the time we returned to Baker Street that night, the fog had thickened again, pressing itself against the windows like a curious listener. Holmes set the watch on the table, and with the same careful respect he might show a venomous specimen, opened it beneath the lamplight. The frozen hand still pointed to 5:17. The case gleamed cleanly. The lie was in its cleanliness. You have the river's code, I said. You saw Miles meet the clerk. You have Haskett and Vale's shadow in the background. What now? Holmes's eyes did not leave the watch. Now, he said, we make them speak in the only language they cannot edit, panic. He rose and moved to his writing desk, scrawling notes with brisk precision. Not long letters, not pleas, not accusations. Summonses, invitations dressed in courtesy, edged with inevitability. One to Miles Ashdown, one to Mr. Wickers, one to Mr. Finch at Finch and Roper, one to Mrs. Harrow, and one delicately phrased to Mrs. Viola Ashdown herself, so that she would arrive not as a defendant, but as an honored witness to her own life. I watched him seal the envelopes, each with a stamp pressed down like a verdict. You are bringing them to Baker Street? I asked. No, Holmes said, to Ashdown House. The words startled me, back into the room. Holmes's gaze lifted. The room is the theatre, he said softly, so we shall perform in it, not to amuse ourselves, to force the actors to forget their lines. He sent the letters by hand through an errand boy who owed him favors, then sat again, still as stone. For a long time he listened to the fire as if the crackle were telling him where to place each person in space and time. When he finally spoke, it was not to me, but to the air. "The locked room is real," he murmured, "but the locked room is not the mystery. The mystery is the minute." Before dawn, Holmes slipped out alone and returned only after daylight had begun to pale the fog. He did not tell me where he had been. He placed a folded paper on the table instead. The paper was thick, familiar with seals, and yet different in one subtle way. Its edges were worn, as though it had been handled and hidden and handled again. "Mrs. Harrow," I said, recognizing the shape of her careful handwriting. Holmes nodded. "From her drawer," he replied. "The drawer she keeps beneath folded linens, where servants hide the truths they cannot put in the parlor." I unfolded it slowly. It was an addendum, a second deposition, unfiled, unsealed by any solicitor's office. It was written with less restraint than the first and more honesty. It spoke of what Mrs. Harrow had refused to say under a lawyer's gaze, how Mr. Wickers had asked her to keep it tidy when she wrote, how Miles had stood too close while she spoke, smiling softly, correcting small details like a man arranging flowers. How the widow had not been merely present, but watched like a prisoner watched by polite guards. And then, near the end, a line that made my stomach tighten. The watch was not the same watch she had seen in the house before. Holmes's voice was quiet. "They edited her," he said. "The first deposition is a legal coat hung neatly on a hook. This is the body beneath it." By late afternoon, Ashdown House was filled again, but this time it was not filled with the false calm of yesterday's interrogation. It was filled with anticipation, like a room where a storm is about to break. Mrs. Harrow stood rigid by the mantel, eyes hard, arms folded as though she were defending the hearth itself. Lena hovered near the doorway, pale, her loyalty and fear twisting together like rope. Mr. Wickers sat with his papers as always, yet his fingers kept tapping the edge of his folder as if checking it was still real. Mr. Finch had arrived in person, his polite face strained by indignation at being summoned out of his chambers. And Miles Ashdown, Miles arrived last, coat immaculate, smile polished, as though he believed charm could still outrun truth. Mrs. Viola Ashdown entered quietly, and the room changed in the instant she crossed the threshold. Every gaze either avoided her or measured her. Every man's posture shifted, as if the presence of a widow required a particular kind of carefulness. Yet she did not shrink. She wore her black dress like an oath. Holmes did not greet them with warmth. He greeted them with structure. "Thank you for attending," he said evenly. "We are here to read the deposition again." Mr. Finch's lips tightened. "Mr. Holmes, I must protest." Holmes lifted a hand. "You may protest later," he said. "Your profession has had ample time to speak. Now we listen." He began to read Mrs. Harrow's first deposition aloud, exactly as written, just as Phipps had demanded. But this time Holmes read it differently. He did not rush. He paused at strategic places, between sentences, between claims, between the neat legal seams where the truth had been stitched too tightly, and at each pause he did something cruelly gentle. He invited correction. The door was closed from within, Holmes read, then looked up. Closed by whom? Mrs. Harrow. Mrs. Harrow's jaw worked. By Mr. Reginald, she said, voice firm. Holmes nodded as though accepting it, then continued. The spare key was fetched from the pantry hook, he read. He paused and let the silence stretch, watching the room. Mr. Wickers, he said mildly, you were nearest the door. How long did it take for Mrs. Harrow to fetch that key? Wickers blinked, then answered too quickly. A minute, perhaps two. Holmes's eyes moved to Miles. And you, Mr. Ashdown? Miles smiled. A minute, he said almost lazily. No longer. Holmes let the agreement hang there. Then he asked softly, Mrs. Ashdown. The widow's eyes flicked to Miles, then to Holmes. Long enough for a great many thoughts, she said quietly. Long enough for me to realize someone wanted us to believe in impossibility. Miles's smile thinned. Mr. Finch's gaze sharpened toward her, as if offended she had spoken outside the script. Holmes continued. The room was empty, he read, then paused. Empty is a word that sounds absolute, yet absolutes are where liars hide. Mrs. Harrow was anything disturbed. Mrs. Harrow hesitated. The tea, she said reluctantly, 1 cup half filled, as if someone lifted it and set it down, Holmes finished for her, and the watch was on the rug, at 17 minutes past 5. He reached into his pocket, withdrew the watch, and held it at chest height so the light caught it. I will ask again, he said, voice still calm. Who benefits if Mr. Reginald Ashdown is declared dead? Mr. Finch opened his mouth. Holmes did not allow him the comfort of speaking first. Holmes's gaze moved directly to the widow. Madam, he said, you have been threatened with ruin. You said as much in this room. I do not need you to name the threat yet. I need you to answer this. If Reginald is declared dead, what happens to the estate? Mrs. Ashdown's hands tightened on the chair arm. It becomes simpler, she said, the word bitter. Simpler for whom? Holmes asked. Her eyes lifted. For those who want control, she said softly. Miles laughed sharp. Control, my dear Viola. She turned her face toward him, and the look she gave was not widow's softness, but a woman's exhausted contempt. Do not call me dear, she said. The room went still. Holmes returned to the deposition and read the line about the key again, and again, letting its rhythm become hypnotic. Then, like a man gently pulling a thread, he introduced the part he knew would tear the fabric. He set the first deposition down and lifted the second. Mr. Finch's head snapped up. What is that? He demanded. Holmes looked at him as though Finch had asked what the moon was. The unfiled addendum, he said, the portion you chose not to place in the record. Mr. Finch stood so abruptly his chair scraped. That paper, where did you obtain? From Mrs. Harrow's drawer, Holmes replied, where it was hidden after your office decided it was too untidy. Mrs. Harrow's eyes flashed. He told me it would ruin the case, she said, pointing at Finch. He told me my extra words would make the magistrate laugh. He told me to keep it clean. Mr. Finch's face hardened. I advised you, he snapped, as a solicitor must. Emotion confuses facts. Holmes's voice cut through, soft and deadly. No, emotion reveals motives, and motives are what your clean version attempted to erase. He began reading the second deposition aloud, and the room changed with every sentence. Mrs. Harrow's words were sharper here, less polished. She described how Miles hovered while she spoke, correcting her memory with a smile. How Mr. Wickers repeated phrases to her as if teaching. How the widow was watched. And then the line about the watch, how it did not match the one she had seen in the house before. Lena made a small, strangled sound. Miles's smile vanished. That's enough, Miles said sharply, stepping forward. This is absurd. You cannot drag my family through mud on the basis of a servant's scribbles. Mrs. Harrow took a step toward him, shoulders squared. I ran your family, she said, voice trembling with restrained fury. I watched you grow from a boy who stole biscuits to a man who steals truth. Miles's face darkened. Watch your tongue. Holmes's gaze stayed on Miles. There it is, he murmured. Not innocence, ownership. Miles swung toward Holmes, anger rising. You're enjoying this, he hissed. You've always enjoyed making people look foolish. Holmes's voice remained even. I enjoy precision, he said, and you are imprecise when you are frightened. Mrs. Ashdown's breath shook. I could see her caught between two horrors. the horror of a scandal becoming public, and the horror of staying trapped inside a mechanism built by men who would never suffer its consequences. Her eyes flicked to Lena, then to Mrs. Harrow, then to the watch in Holmes's hand. Holmes turned slightly toward her, and his voice softened, not indulgent but human. "Madam," he said quietly, "they have used your name like a seal on their documents. If you remain silent, they will continue. If you speak, they will attempt to destroy you. But speaking gives you one advantage. You choose the truth rather than letting London choose it for you." Mrs. Ashdown's lips parted. For a moment she looked as if she might collapse. She didn't. She straightened, shoulders lifting as though she were putting on her own armor again, this time by choice, not by coercion. "I will not be the face of their lies," she said, voice low but steady. Miles's eyes widened. "Viola, think what you're doing." "I am," she said, for the first time. Holmes nodded once, as if acknowledging a door had finally opened. Then he lifted the watch again. "This," he said, "is the mechanism that binds your story together. It is not a family heirloom in the state you claim. It has been altered recently. The clasp is mismatched. The internal catch produces a double-click signal." He pressed it lightly, and the faint double-click sounded in the silence like a small knock on a coffin lid. Mr. Wickers flinched. Lena's hands flew to her mouth. Miles went very still. Holmes continued, calm as a surgeon. "A signal implies a receiver. A receiver implies coordination. And coordination implies a planner with access to the watch, access to the room, and the knowledge to commission the alteration without raising suspicion." Miles scoffed, but his voice cracked. Anyone could commission a repair. Holmes's eyes did not blink. "Not anyone would know to request a signal," he said. "Not anyone would know the river's code of receipts. Not anyone would know that a watch stopped at a minute can stand in for a signature when paper is too dangerous." He looked at Mr. Finch. "You did not commission it. You are too concerned with legality to risk such a crude device." He looked at Mr. Wickers. "You did not commission it. You are nervous, and nervous men do not create, they obey." He looked at Lena. "You did not commission it. You were used." He looked at Mrs. Harrow. "You did not commission it. You recorded what you were allowed to record." Then his gaze returned to Miles, and the room seemed to shrink around that point. "You did," Holmes said quietly, "because you had the opportunity to handle the watch as a family matter, because you have a habit of small mechanisms in your fingers, snuff boxes, clasps, catches, because you knew enough to seek a watchmaker willing to install a hidden spring, and because you needed a signal not to escape but to confirm compliance." Miles's face flushed dark, then pale. "You can't prove." Holmes's voice cut in gently. "I can," he said, "because the catch is placed where only a man familiar with the watch's natural handling would put it, where the thumb rests when closing the case. A stranger would place it elsewhere. A watchmaker would place it logically. You placed it conveniently." Miles's eyes darted to the door. Holmes did not move to block him. He did not need to. "Sit," he said softly, and the word landed with unexpected authority. Miles did not sit, but he stopped moving, trapped by something more powerful than physical restraint. The knowledge that every eye in the room now saw the crack in his charm. Holmes set the watch down on the table between them like a final exhibit. "The locked room was made to look supernatural," Holmes said, voice steady, "but it was logistical. The tea tray was brought in to establish normality. The raised voices were a lure. The door was closed to establish mystery. The watch was placed to establish time. Then at the agreed minute, 5:17, the signal was pressed. Double click, receipt, confirmation to a waiting party that the stage had been set." Mr. Wickers's voice came out thin. "Waiting party." Holmes's gaze flicked to him. "Someone outside this household," he said. someone who needed proof the pressure had been applied, someone who deals in reputations as currency. Mr. Finch's face tightened, fear finally breaking through his professionalism. "Mr. Holmes," he said sharply, "you are treading." Holmes's eyes turned to him like ice. "Yes," he said, "I am treading on the part you wanted kept private." The room held its breath. Holmes could prove how it was done. He had forced the script to tear. He had named the hand that installed the signal. But as I watched Mrs. Ashdown, upright, furious, terrified, refusing to fold, I understood the final danger was not the mechanism. It was the story the city would tell once the mechanism was exposed. Holmes could clear her by truth, or truth could still ruin her by noise. Holmes could prove how it was done, but the last danger still hung in the room like damp fog. Would the truth clear Mrs. Ashdown, or ruin her beyond repair? In the end, it was neither a dramatic confession nor a sudden collapse that settled the matter. It was something quieter and far more devastating to the kind of men who build traps out of reputation. Holmes did not offer them spectacle. He offered them their own tools, turned the right way round. He let the silence stretch after his final demonstration of the watch's double click, until Miles Ashdown's anger had nowhere to hide but in his own breathing. Then Holmes began to speak, not as a performer, but as a recorder, like a documentary voice that refuses to be hurried. "This case," he said evenly, "has been treated as a mystery of vanishing. It is not. It is a mechanism of pressure." He looked first to Mrs. Harrow. "Your deposition was edited," he said gently, "and you were made to believe the edits served truth when they served only neatness. Your second statement tells us what the first tried to conceal. That testimony was rehearsed, that details were fed, that the household was guided like a hand writing a letter." Mrs. Harrow's eyes did not lower. If anything, she looked relieved, as though she had carried the shame of being manipulated and now had permission to place it where it belonged. Holmes turned to Mr. Finch. "Your office received an addendum and chose not to file it," he said, voice still calm. "Not because it was false, but because it was inconvenient. You did not cause this mechanism, Mr. Finch, but you polished it." Finch's mouth tightened, indignation struggling against the growing realization that indignation would not save him. "We advised." "You advised," Holmes interrupted, softly, "as men advise when they fear the public more than they fear wrongdoing." Then Holmes looked to Mr. Wickers. "And you," he said, "recited honesty like a schoolboy recites a hymn. You did not invent the lie, you helped it sound respectable." Wickers's shoulders sagged. His papers slipped slightly in his hands. For the first time, he looked less like a clerk performing propriety and more like a man who had been frightened into obedience. Holmes's gaze returned to Miles Ashdown at last. Miles held himself rigid, jaw tight, eyes bright with the kind of fury that is simply panic in formal wear. "You paid for a narrative," Holmes said, "and when narrative is paid for, it becomes a commodity. You attempted to purchase control over a woman's name, and you used a staged vanishing to apply leverage." Miles's laugh came out harsh and thin. "Leverage," he spat. "You talk as if she's a victim and I'm some street thug." Holmes did not raise his voice. "No," he said, "a street thug would threaten with a fist. You threatened with headlines." The room shifted at that. Even Finch flinched, because it was the truest thing said aloud in that house. Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew the disputed document, the one that bore the missing man's signature and the impossible date. He held it up, not like a weapon, but like a lamp. "And now," he said, "the signature." Miles's eyes flicked to it. Holmes addressed the room. "The document was prepared in advance," he said. "It was signed under pressure, not after the vanishing but before it. The date was left flexible. as respectable frauds often are, inked later to create the appearance of inevitability. A filing date becomes a signing date in the minds of those who wish not to think too closely. Time is edited the way testimony is edited. Mr. Finch opened his mouth, then closed it again. He understood, perhaps too well, how easily that confusion could be dressed in legal clothing. Holmes continued, "This is why the signature appears after the vanishing. It was meant to suggest that Reginald Ashdown remained alive in some lawful capacity, while simultaneously being absent enough to be declared convenient." Miles stepped forward, anger breaking through. "Reginald agreed," he snapped. "He agreed to it, he owed." "Owed," Mrs. Ashdown repeated quietly, and her voice cut through Miles's outburst like a thin, sharp knife. She had not spoken for several beats. Now she did, and the room turned toward her in involuntary attention. Miles's face tightened. "Viola, don't start." "Don't start," she said, and there was no hysteria in her tone, only cold astonishment at the arrogance of being instructed in her own home. "You began this the moment you realized my life could be negotiated like property." Holmes watched her, and I saw in his stillness a rare thing, approval without possessiveness. He had opened a space, she had chosen to step into it. Mrs. Ashdown turned toward Finch and Wickers, her chin lifting the way it had when she tried to survive by composure, but now the composure belonged to her rather than to their script. "I will not have my name used as a seal for arrangements I did not make," she said. "I will not be the face that makes your bargain look decent." Her voice steadied further as she spoke, as if each sentence returned something to her. "If you file anything from this day forward, you will file it with my consent. If you speak of me in your offices, you will speak with evidence, not insinuation. And if you attempt to frighten my servant again," her gaze flicked to Lena, and the tenderness there was quiet but unmistakable, "you will discover that I am not as alone as you assumed." Miles's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, he looked genuinely uncertain, because his trap relied on her believing she had no choices, and she had just chosen. Holmes did not press for a theatrical confession. He didn't need one. He had something better. He moved to the mantel and picked up a small, ordinary object from Mrs. Harrow's second statement, a folded copy of the unfiled addendum, now treated as the central record rather than a nuisance. He held it out toward Finch. "This," Holmes said, "will be filed, along with an affidavit from Mrs. Harrow regarding the editing of her first deposition, and a statement from Miss Bristow concerning the messages she was instructed to carry." Wickers swayed slightly, as though the weight of sworn words had finally landed on him. Miles's voice turned sharp. "You can't." Holmes looked at him. "I can," he said softly, "because you relied on sworn words, you relied on filed papers, you relied on the public's appetite for scandal. Now those same sworn words will be used to protect the woman you attempted to turn into an exhibit." He paused, and the next line was spoken with the kind of restraint that makes it feel like truth rather than triumph. "You wanted the city to gossip about her," he said. "Instead, it will read about you, if you force us to make it public." Miles went very still. He understood the shape of the trap now. Not a policeman at the door, but a reputation ledger turning against him, written in the one ink he could not erase, legal record. The room loosened, not with relief, but with the dull, exhausted acceptance that comes when a lie finally loses its scaffolding. Lena's shoulders sagged as though she had been holding her breath for days. Mrs. Harrow blinked rapidly once, and I realized she was fighting tears not of grief, but of vindication. Mr. Finch looked older by a decade, because men like him age when they are forced to see what their tidiness has protected. Later, after the household had emptied, and the last of their footsteps had faded into the corridor, Mrs. Ashdown remained in the sitting room with us, standing near the window as if she were learning how to occupy her own space without permission. "I may never have a spotless name," she said quietly, not looking at either of us. Holmes's voice was gentle. Spotless is often an illusion sold by men who profit from stains, he replied. Agency is rarer and far more valuable. When we returned to Baker Street, the fog was back, thick as wool against the panes. The familiar rooms felt warmer, as if our hearth understood it was not merely a fire but a refuge. Holmes placed the silver watch on the table and stared at it for a long moment, as though listening for the echo of its double click in the quieter space. I found myself thinking of the case's final irony. A silver watch is meant to measure minutes with impartial honesty, yet this one had measured fear. It had stopped not because time had stopped, but because someone believed time could be commanded by a spring, a signal, a paper, a threat. Holmes pushed the watch toward me. "Keep it," he said. I blinked. Why? Holmes's eyes rested on the frozen hands. Some instruments are made to keep time, he said softly, and others are made to keep people in line. If you're still with me, a quick note. These are the sorts of cases that live in the cracks between law and life, and if you want more stories where the truth has to be earned with patience rather than guessed with noise, staying subscribed means you won't miss the next one. Holmes rose, moved to the window, and pulled the curtain aside just enough to see the lamplight blur in the fog. "London will move on," he murmured. "It always does, but mechanisms like this do not vanish. They simply learn." And in that lingering grey beyond the glass, the case ended. But the question remained, quiet and stubborn as a stopped watch in a warm hand. How many respectable lives are ruled by clocks that were never meant to tick?